Call the regular meeting of the CalSTRS Board to order. Jennifer, if you could take the roll first, please.
Here.
The Director of Finance, Ms. Dunn.
Here.
Ms. Hendricks.
Here.
For the Superintendent of Public Instruction, Ms. Zumant. And for the State Controller, Mr. McGuire. Chairperson Keela, you have a quorum.
Thanks, Ms. Shamani. Item number 1 on our agenda is the approval of the board agenda for today.
So moved.
Okay, it's been properly moved and seconded to approve the agenda. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, thank you. Item number 2 on the agenda is our federal legislative report, and John Stanton is joining us via Skype. I believe it's Skype from Washington, D.C. Ed, do you want to
Yeah, just a couple, just so we can get started. I mean, a couple of things happened the other day that John might be able to fill us in on. So he's coming from DC, and I guess it might be interesting. Also, you can talk about. I think he's scheduled to come. You're supposed to come out here in February, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So it might be good. He'll come out here and give us more up-to-date information around the budget and stuff like that. But he comes out here. He speaks to you guys every couple of times a year, just to give you an update. And given the election results, I thought it would be helpful to get a sense of what he sees going on now. So I'll turn it back over to John.
So John, before you begin, because I don't think you can see all of us, right?
Tech people said that if somebody asked a question that I could see them, so.
Okay, very good. So John, I may interrupt you periodically if I see a committee member that wants to jump in, so just bear with
Please.
us, okay? Go ahead, John.
Well, thank you very much. It's certainly a pleasure to be with you again today. In the wake of a $4 billion election, I just hope that Chris has some local TV station stocks in the portfolio, because they were the big winners in all this, I think, at the end of the day.
We owned all the mailer companies.
TV
Well,
made
that's
out better.
That's why he's one of the top CIOs in the country. So.
That's right.
What I want to do today, just as Ed said, is in the wake of the election, the dust obviously is still settling, but I thought it would be helpful as you look ahead to the remainder of the year, the upcoming lame duck session, and into the new Congress, to try to give you some sort of basic framework in terms of some of the dynamics that'll be going on, so it'll give you kind of a sense to be able to assess what's happening and how it kind of fits in with the path that Congress will be taking. So rather than just saying, well, here's what just happened and give you information of the week's shelf life, try to kind of give you sort of a basis for a framework, point of reference for analyzing things, and talk a little bit at a high level about issues that'll be on the agenda. As Ed said, I come in February where the agenda is much more crystallized, the issues and how they affect CalSTRS are clearer, but I just kind of foreshadowing what may be on the horizon, I think is helpful as you begin to kind of plan your legislative agenda for the coming year. And then finally, to talk about some of the key players, because obviously, you know, there's going to be a considerable shift in Senate side on who's been calling the shots, and to talk a little bit about what might lie in store as a result of those changes in some of the key players. But certainly, you know, in the wake of this massive Republican election wave, I think one of the threshold questions is that going to translate into some Republican legislative juggernaut in the Congress? And I think the answer there is maybe, but probably not so much, because there's going to be this sort of fundamental tension that's going to sort of be ebbing and flowing, I think, throughout the coming months in the Congress that will really affect the ability to get things done. I mean, you heard a very sort of positive statement by the House and Senate GOP leaders yesterday, and President Obama in his press conference about, you know, there ought to be areas of agreement. But basically, there's this inherent tension on the GOP side and in both the House and the Senate between the House and Senate GOP leaders who want to show that they can govern, have a positive agenda to get things done. And then on the other side are elements of their caucus that are saying, hey, this negative agenda, this attacking the administration, this sort of roll everything back, that proved to be a pretty good strategy in 2010, 2014. You know, we won. Why should we be compromising? And I think that's the sort of tension that's going to play itself out in both the House and the Senate in the coming months and on particular issues, I think. And you know, it's going to ebb and flow on particular issues. I mean, basically, you know, on the House side, House Majority Leader McCarthy has said, you know, he wants to be able to govern positively, to show that the GOP leadership can get things done, to be able to write a GOP budget that can pass the Congress. But at the same time, you know, he's still got to contend with this GOP base that is quite fired up at the moment and is looking ahead to 2016 presidential election. And they're saying, you know, why aren't we focusing on the wedge issues? Why are we proposing a compromise with them that we just beat? And he's got members of his own caucus in the House that, you know, many of whom were elected not viewing government as an instrument to do good, but rather a government as something that should be wrestled to the ground and corralled. And so the question really is whether they can agree among themselves in the House and to some extent in the Senate on the Republican side on exactly what their priorities are and how they ought to be carried out. As I had a senior Republican member tell me last year, he says, you know, we got 30 or 40 guys that just want to have a fight. And the question really is now, having, you know, broadened their numbers, are they going to be able to really sort of take on the ability in the House to, you know, have a majority of a majority to pull together, as opposed to saying, why are we compromising, you know, with this administration that they've spent the last 6 years demonizing? And I think that's going to be a big challenge. Similar sort of challenge is on the Senate side. Senate Majority Leader, incoming Majority Leader McConnell, he's a very school deal maker. He's echoed many of the same chords that Leader McCarthy did on the House side, of wanting to restore regular order, be able to get things done, to govern to a positive agenda. But he's got challenges of his own on his side. You know, first of all, he's got to worry about the sort of flip in the election dynamic that he's going to face in 2016. I mean, 2014 was a sort of a uniquely appealing context for the Republicans, because they had many more Democratic seats up than Republican seats, and they had about 7 Democrats who were running in red states that President Obama had lost in 2012. And so really there was this fortuitous opportunity that they availed themselves of, but in 2016 it completely flips. They have 24 Republican seats up, 10 Democratic seats, and of the 24 seats that are up, about half a dozen are in blue states that the president had carried. So it's kind of, you have this almost mirror image of what happened in 2014. And in those states, I mean, you've got sort of moderates, Mark Kirk in Illinois, Pat Toomey running in a blue state in Pennsylvania, Ron Johnson in Wisconsin, Rob Portman in Ohio, Kelly Ayotte in New Hampshire. You know, they're not going to be able to run in those states as kind of the party of no. So they're going to be looking to the leadership saying, look, you know, we need to have a record to run on. We need to have some accomplishments. So I think that will help bolster Leader McConnell's hand in trying to push for legislative accomplishments. But, you know, the Senate is the Senate. And the Republicans have, notwithstanding this wave, have a pretty narrow majority. I mean, in best case scenario, they're going to have about the same number of seats as the Democrats had, and it's well short of the 60 threshold that is necessary, 60 vote threshold that's necessary to really get any serious legislative activity accomplished in the Senate. And so you've got that challenge to Senator McConnell, kind of getting things done. And the other dimension is that there's going to be this tug of war with what I refer to as the rock throwers, you know, Senator Rand Paul, Senator Ted Cruz, who are positioning themselves with the base looking ahead to the 2016 presidential election. So they're going to be saying, hey, you know, this wedge issue, let's fire up the base, you know, let's, on an issue like immigration, you know, we're not going to be able to touch that. We're going to rail against border security, you know, lower taxes, Common Core standards, you know, the evils of the world. And that's not an atmosphere that's sort of conducive to compromise. So they're really pretty daunting challenges facing the House and Senate Republican leaders. And I think that as is starting to come out, I think there are some areas that at least have some initial promise as potential bipartisan issue areas that could be dealt with. Energy, trade, corporate tax reform, and infrastructure spending, I think, are areas at which there's at least some potential for bipartisan action, at least in the Congress. That how the administration is going to play on that still remains to be seen. So I think at the end of the day, the way the leaders are going to try to balance all this out is probably using two tracks, where you're going to have sort of the positive legislative track of kind of maybe smaller bore legislation, as they call it in the parlance of smaller bipartisan bills in energy or in trade, as I'll talk about in a minute, while at the same time periodically bringing up, the red meat, bringing up, having the House pass a bill to repeal Obamacare, to kind of show the base that they're still listening. But again, I think on particular issues that I'll talk about in a minute, this tension is going to sort of, tug of war is going to resolve itself in different ways depending on the particular issue. Now, in terms of issues that are sort of looming, again, by February, I think we'll have a much clearer idea of the issues and how they're going to fit into what historically your legislative priorities have been. But just in terms of sort of what's on the horizon, in the next week or so and what's coming up, the first order of business when Congress comes back for this lame duck session on November 12th is to fund the government for the rest of the year. As you know, the whole government is now kind of temporary. Everything is extended for 2 or 3 months because they can't really reach a deal on anything of substance. Well, now, having been the dog that caught the car, the House and Senate Republican leaders want to clear the decks of this kind of leftover business so that they can start fresh on their own priorities in the new Congress. So the first and foremost is to fund the government for the rest of the current fiscal year. And there's several approaches that are available on that front. One is to have a so-called omnibus appropriations bill, which is basically you sort of bundle together all the individual bills. Now, from our parochial interest, we like that because Elk Hills is in both the House and the Senate bill. So if they go that path, I'd like to check this issue off before I start receiving assisted living literature in the mail. So, every time I come out, I have to have a new reason for why we haven't gotten that yet. So I'm running out of reasons. So we're hopeful. Leader McCarthy has been very helpful on the House side and helping to get the bill, Elk Hills into the House bill. Senator Feinstein put it in the Senate bill. So we're keeping our fingers crossed. If that effort, and they only have between now and sort of Christmas to kind of resolve all that, if that gets bogged down, then they fall back to what's called a continuing resolution, which is basically a very inferior solution because it just continues last year's spending level in all the same ways as it was spent last year. So in terms of ISIS and priorities that have changed, you're just kind of continuing the past without the ability that an appropriations bill offers you to kind of change things around. And there again, the leadership wants to just kind of, okay, if we have to go that route, let's at least do it for the rest of the year. But again, they're going to face pressure from some of the rock throwers to say, wait a second, let's just do a 3-month, spending resolution till we get control, or let's just have a short-term resolution, and then we can stick, kind of have a showdown with the president on our priorities. And so I think that'll be a first litmus test of the ability of the leadership to kind of manage their own. There are a series of other kind of smaller bills that they have to deal with, a lame duck, some expiring tax provisions. They're going to have to extend the terrorism risk insurance program, which is of interest to the commercial building landlords. There's been a disagreement between the House and Senate on the approach to take. So I think there again, when in doubt, let's just make everything temporary and we'll kick the can down the road. But at least it will continue that program that the commercial real estate part of your portfolio really depends on it to a significant degree. So once that's all done, then we get to the new Congress, and they're still in the organizing phase when they come back of kind of juggling the committees and who's chairman of what. You have some idea of who's going to be chairman of the key committees, and so we can kind of speak to that. But in terms of issue areas, at least, that are going to be on the firing line, I think front and center will be a reopening of Dodd-Frank. which obviously is of interest to you all as in your investor capacity. The Senate Banking Committee had been chaired by Tim Johnson, who had successfully kind of intercepted a whole series of Dodd-Frank reopeners that came over from the House. That will now change because Senator Richard Shelby from Alabama is going to be taking over, who voted against Dodd-Frank. He's no sort of friend of big banks. I mean, he believes in stronger capital rules, so he's not just sort of going to say, let's open the floodgates. But nonetheless, I think they're going to reopen Dodd-Frank, which always makes you nervous because once a bill like that is in play, you know, all kinds of things can happen. I mean, what they've been initially focusing on is sort of the too big to fail issue and whether that has been sufficiently sort of managed and the whole process for determining who's systemically important and making that more transparent. But that's an area of interest to both parties, and his counterpart is expected to be Senator Sherrod Brown from Ohio, who's about the most liberal member of the Democratic side in Congress. So that pot in that committee is going to be at a pretty high boil all year. But he and Senator Shelby have a shared interest on this too big to fail. The Wall Street community is expected to try to go after some of the swaps rules that have ended up kind of constraining them. Exactly what they're going to try to do, I think, is still up in the air. It's possible they might make a run to some extent at the Volcker rule as well, which is cut into their profitability. Another area in the Dodd-Frank that's been a big source of contention in the Republicans is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. They feel it's too independent. They want to sort of bring it under congressional oversight and appropriations and have a board and rather than a single person. So those are some of the initial focuses. But anytime a big bill like that is reopened, then it gives plenty of potential for mischief. And so I think that's an area that, you know, we'll be working with Ann Sheehan and Chris and Ed to kind of make sure we've, you know, identified your priorities and are vigilant on that front. Another area, and they kind of classify this as a jobs bill. One of the things you'll find is the quote-unquote jobs bills have a pretty flexible definition, and one of them, and this is particularly sort of pernicious because it seems so innocuous, and that's what's called regulatory reform. I mean, just to show you how broad the jobs bill definition is, I mean, telling the EPA they can't regulate farm dust was said to be a jobs bill. EPA said they don't regulate farm dust, don't plan to, but they said, all right, we're going to bar you anyway. And so it shows you how kind of bills that do one thing are really masquerading under another heading. But this regulatory reform bill is particularly pernicious because it seems so innocuous. It talks about cost-benefit analysis. All regs should have a cost-benefit analysis in these respects. Well, what they're really running off of is the D.C. Circuit opinion on the SEC proxy rules, which through that proxy access rules, which despite hundreds of pages of cost-benefit analysis by the SEC, was found not to be enough. And so if you define the costs, they have to be measured in a very expansive fashion and define the benefits in a way that, you know, ensures that benefits never outweigh costs. That's a very, you know, strong way, but stealthy in a way of curtailing regulation. So that's one that we'll be watching because it can be applied in a variety of contexts, including those that you care about. The pension area, it's interesting. Anytime you change law in a particular area, now it's called reform, even if it's not making things better. So under the rubric of pension reform, the Finance Committee chairmanship in the Senate will shift to Senator Orrin Hatch, who, as I reported last time when I was out last spring, has this SAFE bill, which is intended to enable state and local governments to get out of the business of providing, or at least funding, pensions for their employees. And as I explained, and can go over in more detail when I come out, basically it's a voluntary approach, so they're not mandating anything, which is at least a step, but it basically relies on the use of an annual sort of auction for annuities, to purchase annuities to fund, using the employer-employee contributions to purchase annuities to fund that accrued benefit of each employee for that year. So it basically shifts from the full faith and credit to, you know, the credit of XYZ Life Insurance Company. And, this bill's been out there for a while, but he is continuing to express interest in it. It really arose out of his, he had a very tight race with one of the original pension reformers in Utah, Dan Lillenquist. And so originally this had been seen as maybe a way for him to kind of get on the field to help deflect that, but he has continued to express interest in it and has expressed interest in pursuing it next year. So I think that we will be working with NASR and NCTR and subject to your guidance, but that's going to be on the agenda. And whether that takes place separately or as part of corporate tax reform remains to be seen. Infrastructure, I know that's an area obviously that you all have a strong interest in. Chris came back to the Infrastructure Summit and was quite a prominent presence in that. This is an area, I think, where there could be some creativity if the parties are able to sort of successfully kind of establish a working relationship. And that is that the Highway Trust Fund bill, which is sort of the vehicle for all this, expires at the end of May. And so there's not any appetite on either side of the aisle for raising the gas tax. So what they're trying to do is to look around, particularly when Senator Wyden was chairman of the Finance Committee, see if there's some innovative ways to bring private sector funding onto the field, just new funding sources. So there may be an opportunity on that venue to continue the sort of dialogue that CalSTRS had been participating in. The Finance Committee has reached out to Chris on a number of occasions as a technical expert in the field. I think has recognized that he provides very valuable insight and analysis about what the world's really like in that area for a private investor. And so I think that even though the control in the Senate has changed, I think that will be CalSTRS will be continued to be perceived as a fruitful technical resource on that front. One of the other areas that Senator McConnell and the President identified yesterday is trade. I think that provides an opportunity, at least, for the parties to work together. They need to, in order to really conclude any pending trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is the one that's furthest along with a number of the Asian countries, they need to provide the President with so-called fast-track authority to negotiate an agreement that will be considered on an expedited basis in the Congress. I mean, ironically, after accusing Obama of exceeding his authority in a variety of respects, they would be swallowing hard and giving him authority to conclude these trade agreements, which the Republicans historically have promoted. Interestingly enough, there is this kind of populist sort of Rand Paul sentiment in both the House and Senate GOP caucuses, which, even though the GOP mantra has been one of free trade, has sort of expressed reservations about trade agreements as somehow, not because of the labor outsourcing concern that some of the Democrats have been concerned about, but rather whether the U.S. government is sort of ceding some of its sovereignty to these other nations by entering into these kind of reciprocal arrangements. So, like anything else on the Hill, it's complicated. We'll have to see how that really works itself out. Corporate tax reform was identified as another potential area where the parties might work together across the aisle. Having lived through the Tax Reform Act of 1986 as a young lobbyist, I can say that it's a very daunting challenge, and it's a lot more fun to talk about the broken tax code and to rail against it than it is to do tax reform, which means taking things away from people. And just one little vignette that sort of captures, I think, how difficult an exercise that is, even when there's a lot of interest and sentiment. When House Ways and Means Chairman Camp put out his tax reform draft last fall, this comprehensive tax reform plan, which was, even if you didn't agree with a lot of what was in it, was saluted as a pretty comprehensive plan that really tried to do the right thing from his particular policy perspective. Well, within hours, there was a key constituency of the Republicans that was emailing the leadership, these screams of dismay saying, you've done us in a way that the Democrats never even dreamed of. This is the end of Western civilization as we know it. Who was the constituency? Conservative talk show radio hosts. What was the provision? Chairman Camp proposed to cap the deduction on advertising expenses. He said, well, a big part of advertising is to build the brand. That's a capital item, should be capitalized over a couple of years, shouldn't be able to deduct it fully and deduct the rest of the advertising expense currently on the part you didn't capitalize. Seems like it wouldn't generate, screams of dismay, but apparently if you're a conservative talk show radio host, you depend on advertising for your whole livelihood. And so I think that little vignette caused the leadership to sort of slam the brakes on Chairman Camp, who was going full bore ahead. And they kind of said, wait a second, this is going to affect kind of real people who we care about. So that's really the challenge in tax reform. It requires both parties to agree on something and lock arms, because there's going to be this huge industry onslaught from people like me that are going to say, well, it's the end of Western civilization as we know it for this particular industry. So that's going to be a challenge. And this is this group hasn't had much experience in taking things away from people. So we'll see how that works out. I mean, I think they may make some progress. Whether and how pension reform gets bound up in that, we'll be watching. But just on a couple of other issues, and I don't know if anyone has any questions, but just in terms of financial issues that will affect your portfolio, the debt ceiling comes back up for renewal in March 2015. Now, Leader McConnell yesterday promised there wouldn't be any more drama, wouldn't be any more shutdowns, no more showdowns. But I think this will be the first litmus test of whether they can control their rock throwers, who will want to use this as a way to say, no, we ought to have more spending cuts, we ought to have these extreme sort of policy measures that we couldn't pass under regular order. And so that will be yet another litmus test, a way in which you can kind of judge what kind of progress are they going to be able to make on other issues through the year. And I guess the last area has to do with the the budget and spending plan for the coming year. And that will be the first sort of Republican-only budget and spending package. And I think that in turn will be a challenge for the Republicans now to come up with something on their own and sell it inside their caucus. Ed said a question had been raised about mandatory Social Security coverage, our old friend, one of our perennials on the agenda, and whether that might sort of fall into the mix. I mean, I think that from just a pure deficit reduction perspective, as you probably read, I mean, the deficit is at a historic low since 2008 of 2.8% of GDP. So there's not the same sort of, oh my God, we're going to go broke next year, which had caused us in early years to fear that mandatory coverage could be kind of peeled off and stuck in as a kind of a standalone revenue raiser. So I think my sense of it, pending, seeing how things unfold a little more, we should have a better sense come February, is that they will keep mandatory coverage as sort of a pay for future entitlement reform efforts, for future Social Security reform efforts. I mean, that has been kind of the scenario that everyone has feared, that they just kind of use that and the upfront cash that it generates to help fund a transition to a new system where you've got to pay benefits to current people and then have some other arrangement to generate benefits for the folks that aren't going to be paying into Social Security as much anymore. So we have our eye on that. I'll tell my friends out in the audience. But I think hopefully, for the immediate term, it's not a real threat. And then the last area I just wanted to kind of touch on quickly, unless there are questions, and that's the key players, because obviously this is not just some automatic mechanism. It's flesh and blood individuals who, with all their quirks and eccentricities and strengths and weaknesses, who are actually kind of doing all this stuff. And the real thing that control of the Senate gives you is the ability to set the agenda. You still need 60 votes, which requires bipartisanship to get a bill out of the Senate, but there are lots of ways in which being in control of the party and having the chairmanship, you can control what issues are brought up and how they're brought up. And so there is going to be a fairly sea change between the change in control and retirements that have happened in the Senate on the key committees of interest. I've talked already about the finance committees. Senator Orrin Hatch will be taking over. I mean, he has worked with plans in the past. I have an autographed bill in my office when he spearheaded our carve out from the non-discrimination rules. So he is a person who likes to get things done. I mean, he'd worked with Teddy Kennedy on children's health issues. So I think, he's got a legacy. He's supposedly in his last term. And I think he'll be one that, will be someone that will try to get things done who is sort of open to working with folks. On the Appropriations Committee, Thad Cochran, sort of a fan of regular order, is going to take over. An interesting person to focus on is on the Budget Committee, the Senate Budget Committee, and the way it works in Congress is a little different than the way you guys do your budget. The way it works in Congress is their so-called budget. But the budget is just, it decides how big the pie is, but it doesn't say what's in the pie. It doesn't give the details. So it's very important for sort of giving an overall number that then defines, what the individual programs, once you pass through the detail, how much spending can occur there. The person taking over Senate budget is Jeff Sessions, a Republican from Alabama, who is a very, very hard-nosed, he makes Paul Ryan almost look like a liberal in terms of his approach to the budget. So he conceivably could come up with a pretty draconian budget that will, regenerate controversy about spending cuts. He can't control what kind of spending cuts are implemented, but he can control how big the pie is if he can have gain a majority of his folks. So it's somebody to kind of watch, because that could reopen this whole fracas over draconian spending cuts, and that's at least the potential that mandatory might come back on the table in that sort of environment. We've talked about financial services with Senator Shelby. On the health, education, labor, and pensions, Senator Harkin retired, and Senator Lamar Alexander, who at least has been to a school, he was Secretary of Education, so I think that will be sort of helpful of all the people that could be selected for that. I think he is at least familiar with the challenges faced by the education community, and I think he's been fairly sympathetic on a lot of fronts in that vein. Then there are going to be a couple of rookies. John Thune, sort of a rising star on the Republican side, is going to take over the Commerce Committee, which deals with a lot of tech issues, and Lisa Murkowski on energy. On the House side, it looks as though Paul Ryan will be taking over for Mark Camp, who'd retired. There's going to be a little bit of a race with Kevin Brady, but I think Ryan clearly has the inside track on that. On the Budget Committee, again, you have another quite conservative person taking over, Tom Price, and so it'll be interesting to see how that dynamic plays itself out. The leaders, I think, are not wanting to get into a whole big spending fracas this time around. Again, they want to be sort of viewed as doing things that are positive for people, as opposed to everything being a cut. But that'll be an interesting challenge. On the Oversight Committee, which has been sort of the bane of the administration's existence, with these constant hearings led by Darrell Issa, I think both parties will breathe a sigh of relief, because Chairman Issa is term limited, so he'll be sort of shuffling off into the darkness this time around. And then lastly, on the Financial Services Committee, there's an interesting dynamic going on here, because as you know, we've worked with Maxine Waters quite closely on a number of issues affecting investors. She's actually a STRS member. She taught at the State College system at one point. And what's happened is that the chairman of the Financial Services Committee, Jeb Hensling, is a very conservative member of Congress who believes sticking to your principles till the very end is just absolutely critical. And so he's had difficulty managing some major legislative issues. And as a result, Maxine Waters, who's now the ranking Democrat on that committee, and for those of you that have worked with her, I mean, when she has this sort of firebrand image, but she's always very well prepared. She's very capable. She's tenacious, and she's very politically canny. And so what's happened is the GOP leadership has gone to her to cut deals, because she can deliver her side on some of these issues where the chairman has not been flexible enough to compromise. And so it'll be interesting to kind of watch that dynamic unfold. There's another member, Frank Lucas, who's outgoing chairman of the Agriculture Committee, has talked about running against Hensling. I think that will kind of play itself out shortly. So, the financial services area, obviously now having two Republican committees, you're not going to have the same ability to sort of stop things in the Senate. There's still the veto pen, of course, but that will be an area of activity that really bears close scrutiny. When I was out last spring, I put up a graphic about the California delegation and how, retirements and defeats and sort of loss of seniority and what effect that was having. And unfortunately, that trend has sort of continued. I mean, obviously, we've lost Bill Thomas, who'd been chairman of House Ways and Means, in addition to being the Elk Hill sponsor, David Dreyer, chairman of House Rules, Jerry Lewis, chairman of House Appropriations, Buck McKeon, chairman of Armed Services. But, the trend has just sort of continued. George Miller, who was former chairman of the Education and Labor Committee, Henry Waxman, Howard Berman, all in key committees. I mean, that sort of seniority and knowledge of the issues and cloud is not something that's sort of easily rebuilt. And so California, there's still plenty of bright spots. Still plenty of bright spots. I think the principal bright spot for us is the fact that Kevin McCarthy has sort of mirrored, for those of you that can recall, when his days in the legislature, when as I understand he became a minority leader in his first term in the Assembly, he's kind of replicated that in the House and become majority leader under sort of fortuitous circumstances, but nonetheless, in a very short period of time, he's well liked, he's well regarded, he's been very helpful to us on Elk Hill. So he will be, CalSTRS has a good working relationship with him. We've always had to work with folks on both sides of the aisle because that's just the way it is. And so we'll continue to be able to work with him in the future, and I think he will be a great resource for CalSTRS. Senator Feinstein continues to be a senior member, notwithstanding the change in control of the Appropriations Committee, which traditionally has sort of worked on more of a nonpartisan basis. So if, God forbid, we got to come around the track one more time on Elk Hills, I think she'll be prepared to help us in a position to do so. Nancy Pelosi has announced her intention to run again for minority leader. Maxine Waters, who I talked about earlier. So the list of available sort of resources to draw upon has shrunken considerably, but you make do with what you have. So I guess just to kind of sum up here, and then I'm happy to field questions. I mean, it clearly we're ending up with divided government, but maybe not in the traditional way, because it's divided government in a number of respects. I mean, in the House, it's divided government where you got the House GOP leadership kind of wrestling with these 30 or 40 folks that just want to have a fight. In the Senate, you've got this tug of war between these moderates that are running in blue states versus the folks that are trying to position themselves for 2016 and appeal to the base and say, no, we ought to be, looking for wedge issues, not getting things done. And then the last factor is, there's always been this sort of friction between the House and the Senate. So all this is, kind of divided government before you even get to the president and his veto pen. So I think it's going to be an interesting period of time. There are obviously going to be some growing pains, and look forward to coming back in February. And by then, I think the agenda will be fleshed out in more detail, and we can actually have more of a discussion on substantive issues. But what I wanted to do is just give you kind of a sense of the dynamics and how they could be playing out in the coming months, because I think being able to sort of understand this kind of tension, as I refer to it, I think will help, and how the leaders are managing that, I think ultimately determine their ability to have a legislative success. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to field any questions that people have on specific issues or developments.
Thank you, John. Any questions or comments from the committee? Ed, you want
Just have one quick question. John, do you have any sense of, we've got in California secure choice, which is like a retirement for private workers. Is there any interest, any change in the interest in perhaps doing it at a federal level or in doing something like that at a more national level?
I don't know. I mean, it'll be interesting to see how that issue is viewed. I mean, clearly there's a recognition that you see these numbers that come out with fair regularity. The GAO, I think, just did a recent study on typical IRA balances, and it's extremely scary to see people who what the median balance of an IRA is and what the balance is for someone that's 5 years short of retirement. It's clearly not enough, and I think there's a recognition of that on both sides of the aisle. Senator Harkin had this broad-ranging plan that would have sort of in effect created kind of a federal system, almost akin to kind of Social Security, sort of this universal system that people could participate in. But I think that with this crowd in there now, they're going to be wary of creating a whole new sort of bureaucracy, and having just sort of spent the last years railing against Obamacare, I think any sort of federal program that's going to smack of oversight and administrative burden, but so they're much more interested in sort of private sector type solutions where there'd be vendors running, just kind of like Senator Hatch. He's looking to life insurance company annuities to sort of take over the burden of public plan funding. So they tend to look for sort of privately managed funding situations, but it's like pushing on a string, to get people to save. They've had these savers credits, to try to get people started, give them a little, a subsidized amount that could be put aside, and it's a challenge because those haven't been particularly successful, and so I whether there'll be an appetite for a big new quote federal program remains to be seen. So my guess is there's going to be tinkering around the edges.
John, I have a question, actually two. One is around, there's been a lot of discussion about the amount of U.S. capital that's offshores and repatriating of those dollars and bringing them back. At the same time, there's a lot of evidence about stagnant wages in America. And do you see any, it's unlikely given the fact that people can't agree on what day it is in Washington sometimes, that it's possible, but the repatriating of those dollars, what it could mean to the economy with some sort of deal where those dollars were brought back in and then reinvested into some sort of deal for reinvesting the capital into American companies or American workers?
Yeah, that's an interesting area because for the first time well, let me back up a second. First of all, it's a bit of a misnomer that I think some of the tax reformers have sold about these foreign earnings, because they're offshore in a financial accounting sense, but they're actually all on deposit in banks in New York. So technically it's sort of deployed already through the commercial banking system, but nonetheless, there's been a lot of interest in using the repatriated earnings for infrastructure funding. Chairman Camp, in his tax reform proposal, actually earmarked $150 billion, as I recall, of the it may have been more than that, but a significant hunk of the offshore earnings would be used to help fund the Highway Trust Fund for infrastructure spending. What you run into on that front is a conflict between the U.S. multinational community, which wants to use those offshore earnings as a way of funding a move to a territorial system in which their foreign business activities would not be taxed. And to transition to a new system, you need some way to pay for it, and that's the way they choose to pay for it. So under that scenario, that money would be spent and in effect give them a future tax break. But it's interesting that you raise that, because there has been a bipartisan glimmer of hope that maybe that some of those earnings could be deployed in the context of infrastructure spending, where, as I said earlier, they can't raise the gas tax politically. They're looking around for a variety of new sources of funding. Maybe public partnerships are part of it, but Chairman Camp acknowledged it. The president, in his budget, had a similar variation of a proposal. So I think I would regard that as a live topic for discussion in the context of dealing with infrastructure, and certainly the Highway Trust Fund bill provides a vehicle for that kind of solution to be considered. And the question really is, is there going to be it's almost a fight within the business community, between the multinationals who want to spend that money so that they can have tax reform that won't tax their foreign earnings, versus other segments of the business community that benefit more directly from infrastructure spending and say, hey, wait a second, that money is, in a book sense, is sitting offshore. So I guess I would say stay tuned on that score, because clearly you're right. I mean, that money could be deployed in public works projects, which are labor intensive, and construction jobs are good jobs. So that at least offers the potential for doing that, and that could be an area where both sides could really come together, because it's not necessarily cuts one way or the other ideologically. So we've been following that, especially given CalSTRS' interest in infrastructure, and we'll continue to keep you up to date on proposals to do that. John Delaney, who happens to be my congressman in the Washington area, freshman, he used to be. He says he's the only CEO of a publicly traded company, former CEO of a publicly traded company in Congress. He came up with this approach. It's a little more complicated, but basically to draw upon these repatriated foreign earnings, he gave the companies an incentive to bring them back if they would invest it in these infrastructure funding instruments, invest a portion of it, and he got quite a broad bipartisan cross-section of co-sponsors. So I think there are a lot of people that are sort of have the same idea that you raised, and they're kind of pushing and pulling in different ways to see if there's a way to kind of make that work. So as I say, stay tuned. We'll continue to watch that for you and to report on developments.
Just one other question, I think that'd probably be it, John. There's no arguing about what the markets have done the last 5 or 6 years, but at the same time, corporate profits are at an all-time high, and there's also quite a few people who are still looking for full-time work. And one of the arguments that CEOs and corporations have put forward is that there was still too much uncertainty around regulation and what government was going to do in Washington, D.C., so they needed to really build up their capital, and it was the uncertainty out of Washington, D.C. that they were worried most about. And now pundits are saying, well, that uncertainty's kind of gone. The quote-unquote era of big government and it's going to be pushed back against. Do you see this change in Washington could it actually be beneficial to the markets and give people more confidence and say, well, yeah, that level of uncertainty, maybe that cloud isn't as dark as we thought it was, so we're going to put some of that money that we have on the sidelines to work and hire more people or give people more full-time jobs? How do you see that playing out?
Well, I think a lot of that is all perception, because I'm certainly not an expert in terms of corporate treasury management, but I think that was my own personal view, is that was a convenient excuse. There was uncertainty coming out of the 2008 meltdown, and I think people were hoarding cash because they didn't know, demand was slow to recover, stagnant wages, as you point out, and so and productivity was pretty high. They were able to keep their labor costs from going up, and so they ended up stockpiling cash. In fact, I think there was an article in the Journal yesterday or today about that. They're having to almost kind of stuff it under the mattress. They're kind of running out of places to put it as a treasury function. But I think my own personal view is that the regulatory avalanche was a bit sort of overwrought, and it's kind of a talking point, because studies have shown that despite this image of the Obama administration just sending out a flood of regulations, that actually in sheer numbers it's about at or less than what had been the level under the Bush administration in 2007, 2008. It happens that a number of them are controversial, like the EPA regulations affecting coal emissions and that sort of thing. But to the extent that this is really sort of a perception that this was going to happen to them, I think you're right in the sense that they feel as though with a more business-friendly Congress, that they have more ways in which to sort of curtail through the oversight process, hearings and naming and shaming, political pressure, and then the ultimate pressure, which is the power of the purse. I think there really is an ability to influence that. But again, maybe that's been a convenient excuse, which now that it would go away, they may still be sitting there. So, that's kind of a quixotic answer to your question, but it's you're kind of having to deal with the perception and the reality in both pieces of the answer. So, we'll have to see, I guess. But
Okay.
certainly, that fear, if it were, a true fear, I think should, as you point out, should be alleviated. Now, whether that will cause a change in behavior, though, is an open question in my mind.
Very good. Thank you, John. I don't see any other questions. So thanks. We look forward to seeing you in February.
Okay, and as I've said before, I mean, to the extent things come
Okay.
up in between, feel free to
Bye-bye,
send a
John.
note to Ed if you've got a query. I'm
Hi,
happy.
John. My seat
So-
froze, so I.
Okay.
I'm sorry, was there one more question? Or?
No, we wish you well, and we'll see you in February.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, John.
Take
Bye-bye.
care.